we have to differentiate between management and leading.
Mm.
Management is literally more like a governance type role. Whereas as a leader, and I think that's harder, as a leader, we have to create an environment, and especially if if we're looking for innovation, we have to create an environment that allows for that perceived failure.
Welcome back to another installment of the Next Gen Case Study Series. On this episode today, we have Gavin Grounds, who is the CEO and co-founder of Mercury Risk and Compliance. With an extensive background in technology, cybersecurity, and IT engineering, Gavin is a globally recognized thought leader in risk management and cybersecurity strategy. His illustrious career includes executive roles at Meta, Verizon, DXC, and HP, which later turned into HPE, where he has led groundbreaking initiatives in risk quantification and cybersecurity, which is why we're excited to have him on the show. Gavin, welcome to the program.
Thank you, David. It's a pleasure to be here.
I assure you the pleasure is all mine, Gavin. Before we get too far into the weeds here, I'd like to just start with maybe a couple of minutes on your background, who you are, where you came from, and how you landed as the CEO and co-founder of Mercury Risk and Compliance.
Yeah, sure. So as you can probably hear in the accent, home for me is Austin, Texas. So it's I'm clearly an implant to Austin, Texas. I moved to Austin in about 2011. My origins are actually, my family are fundamentally Irish, out of Limerick, for anyone who's familiar with the island of Ireland. And then I was raised just outside of Liverpool, England. So this is kind of almost like not quite Scouse accent, if you're familiar with Scouse with somebody from Liverpool. But that's where I was raised. That's where I did my studies. And then from there, I almost accidentally got into engineering. I was actually studying microbiology originally. And so I then got into engineering. I literally had an accident at work that crushed my hand. That meant I was office bound. And so I got into writing code and communication protocols and wind the clock forward. I left England, lived in Bermuda for 5 years. So I cut my teeth in technology and offshore finance. And then from Bermuda to just north of Dallas in Texas. And then from there, I lived in Spain for a few years. Then went back to Texas. Then I lived in Malaysia for a few years in Kuala Lumpur. And then when I went back to Texas, it wasn't Dallas anymore. Austin was the destination. Primarily, as you can see in the background there, your drum kit. So one of the big attractions for me for Austin is the music scene, of course, and it's a great city to stay fit and healthy in as well. So that was my journey to still not having a Texas accent. Yeah, and like I say, I started out as a software engineer, literally writing communication protocols and machine code, and really just started to focus on not just the art of the tech, if you like, but really using it to solve business problems. And that's really what gave me the opportunity to really have such an incredible. I've enjoyed it my life so far. Just incredible opportunities and literally emigrating across countries to different countries multiple times. And so that's kind of, so for me, the music is also a passion, but there's an art in the science as well when we can kind of marry, using technology to solve problems, or to create even new opportunities. So that's kind of been a bit of a driver for me, essentially throughout my whole career.
You're a well-traveled gentleman, as it were. I get a sense that through those travels, and especially the kind of the universe's little nudge into computers, I get a sense that you're a very resilient and resourceful person, and I wonder how that has served you in your ventures as you have explored these different things that you've done in these different places, like completely different continents and countries and spaces. How has that resilience and resourcefulness served you?
So I think from a resilience perspective, there's something I read years ago, and it kind of keeps resurfacing for me periodically. And it's a hashtag that I started to use on some social media posts that I really need to start doing again. But it was 5-second tourist. So I don't know if you're familiar with that, but 5-second tourist. The idea behind it is some of the most mundane things that you'll do, like if you go to the office every day and you take the exact same route, it would literally be to like walk that route or get on the train or whatever, and just kind of imagine for a minute it's the first time you've ever done it. So, for example, living in Austin, I still have to pinch myself sometimes because we're right in downtown Austin. You're right by the lake. You've got this whole vibrant city around you. Um, and it's so easy just to take it for granted that, I'm walking down streets and I'm thinking, well, when I was 12 years of age, I never imagined for 1 second that I would live anywhere else except either England or maybe over in Ireland. And so I'm like, what would it be like to walk down the city of streets of Austin like I've never seen it before? Like it literally was the first time. So from a resilience perspective, Devin, just to answer your question specifically, I think, we hear a lot about be curious. And I think there are different ways we can interpret that. Being curious could often mean like, don't be arrogant. Don't assume you know everything already. And that clearly is one way to think about be curious. But for me, that kind of curiosity, if you like, helped to allay a lot of fears. Because, like, for example, when I moved to Bermuda, and I was, I had young children at the time, a boy and a girl, I'd never even visited Bermuda. So it's like, I accepted this job and was relocating my family to a place that I'd never even seen. And so it would be inaccurate for me to say there wasn't like a whole litany of fear associated with that. But that curiosity, and also just to give myself permission to, like, you know what, if for whatever reason, if this doesn't turn out to go the way that I would like it to go, I can always just go back and start again. And almost like giving yourself permission to what might be perceived as fail, but it's not really failing. It's just giving yourself permission to say you might need to adjust your course. I never did go back. Once I left England, I've been back to visit, but I don't live there, and never have since. So that resiliency, I think, is very closely related to curiosity, but equally, it's absolutely perfectly normal, not even okay. It's perfectly normal to actually be afraid of stuff.
Mm.
So they, oh my goodness, I don't understand the thing about where I'm about to go to or whatever. And then don't, for me, it was like, don't be worried if you kind of look stupid sometimes, there's no such thing as being stupid or looking stupid. You just, if you're seeing something for the first time, you're experiencing something for the first time, it's going to be novel. That's what the word means, novel, right? It's new. So I think in general that giving myself permission to be afraid, give myself permission to be anxious, and preemptively give myself permission to change course if I need to. I guess that translates to, well, that's resilience. It's the ability to recover from something that you didn't expect, essentially.
What I loved so much about that, Gavin, was the looking at things with new eyes. I I don't know if you had this same experience, but I have a son. He's 10 now. We took him to Disneyland when he was, I think, 4 or 5. Old enough that he kind of knew what was going on. We didn't have to push him around in the cart anymore, but still young enough that this was magical to him.
Yeah.
And, as a parent, going to a really large theme park that is overcrowded can be a very stressful and daunting task. And I found myself in probably the most joyous state I have ever been in my entire life, living vicariously through his perspective on all of these wondrous things that we were experiencing, right to, I think, what I'll call the kind of peak climax of our time that day. We were watching a Frozen musical live theater play, and it was about midway through that and I'm just like, even now still moved by it. I broke down in tears, just crying because of how amazing this experience was for this little boy. He was just so enthralled with the whole thing, and so I I took that as a signal from, the Lord himself or whoever or whatever to adapt the way that I was looking at the world, because I obviously, you go through life and you have some negative experiences, and it can quite quickly make you a jaded person. And so this was
Yeah.
an eye opener for me, and to just to hear that somebody else has had um, a similar experience, or at least shares that perspective, is really refreshing. It's nice to know that you're not alone in all of that.
Well, as you were saying that, Devin, I was literally going to say, did you cry? because it is. I think that and it's very human to do it, and I think, but sometimes we fail to just look at life like that, if that makes sense. Like
Mm.
I've been asked multiple times, what was your favorite place you ever lived? Because I lived in different countries and so on. And I can honestly and genuinely say that I can't necessarily pick out one specific one that was my favorite, because what I tried to do is just appreciate something about everywhere that I was. Like, for example, in Spain, I had preconceived ideas. We all do. That's human nature. I had preconceived ideas about what it would be like to live in Spain. But when I lived there, which is different to visiting a place, where you actually live in there, we deliberately chose to live in a town where um, we were the only family that spoke English. And there are plenty of places in Spain where you can get away with just speaking English or just speaking German or whatever. But we did that because I wanted to say, I wanted the experience of like, this is what it's like to be a local in Spain. And we, when we lived in Malaysia, we lived in downtown Kuala Lumpur. Now, the apartment we lived in was a really nice apartment. We weren't sharing a kitchen with other families and things like that. But the location was still right in the heart of Kuala Lumpur.
Mm.
So there were suburbs, if you like, or districts that were expat central. But for me, it's like I don't want to live in Spain, like England with sunshine. you know, what I wanted to do is feel what it's like to live in Spain. So for me, Spain is like, it was only when I lived there I realized there are 4 different languages that are spoken in Spain, actual languages, not just dialects. 4 different languages. 3 of them are Romance languages, and 1 is more like a Celtic type language, like up in the Basque region. But then therefore you've got different cultures there, and then you've got different food types there, and you've even got different physical looks from people that the way they look physically, and all of that compacted into a country that's about the size of Texas. And to me, that was just an amazing like learning experience. And then I think just the ability to apply that kind of same mentality like professionally.
Mm.
To me, that's that. So again, when you talk about resiliency, it's like when we have that openness to to learn something that we never knew before, the openness to look like we don't know what we're doing, because the first time we do it, we actually don't know what we're doing. Um, we can apply that to business. We can apply it to technology. We can apply it in our human like interactions. And I think that just makes us naturally resilient. And I think resilience, for me at least, it's a hindsight thing. Like at the time you're going through it, I wasn't even aware that I was trying to be resilient, if that makes sense. It's just that on looking back, I was like, wow, would I have done that? If would I do that now? Like, that was like so scary. You know what I mean? But you just embrace it, and then just fail. And if you're going to fail spectacularly, because then it's more entertaining.
Yeah, right. This the fail fast, fail frequent, fail forward has been kind of one of the cornerstone mantras of the things that I do and the work that I do. And I get a sense that that's part of how you've kind of ended up where you are, even on that idea of giving yourself permission to be afraid, to experiment, to try things, to fall on your face, to pick yourself up. Nobody nobody is going to give that permission to you. You can't go out and ask the world for that. That's something that you have to give to yourself. And so I love that that's kind of your perspective. And I wonder what that has done to shape your approach to the way that you have been innovating in the work that you do. Has that kind of that well, not fearlessness, I don't want to use that word because it's not that. The being comfortable, being uncomfortable aspect of that. How has that helped you innovate in your space?
There's multiple ways to look at that, Devin. So first of all, I do appreciate the way you correct and said, fearless, not being fearless or whatever. I think that is the difference between being courageous and fearless.
Right.
I think if we're fearless, we're probably clueless. Because we don't
That's
know what
not
we should
good
be
either.
afraid of. You know what I mean? Whereas when we're courageous is moving forward in the face of fear.
Right.
So I think that's, even thinking through through the eyes and ears of the audience. I think that fail fast, fail forward. I think as a professional community, in general, especially when we get into like leadership roles, I think we actually invariably we fail to create that kind of environment. What I mean by that is, like, when you think about performance management, for example, if we're in a large organization or even a small organization, if I'm managing a team, I'm going to be measuring the performance of that team, which means I'm going to be measuring the performance of every individual in that team. And so I think there's a very specific art that leaders need to develop, is that we can say the words that we want to encourage this fail fast, fail forward, um, in the interest of innovation. But if we have performance metrics that don't marry well with that or don't match well, then there's a fear, an actual fear, not courage. There's a fear then on the part of the individual, like, okay, so how many times am I allowed to fail fast?
Right.
Right? You know what I mean? So yeah, fail fast, fail fast, fail fast. But at what point is that one too many failures? Or, in fact, is there no such thing as one too many failures, because the one success is going to be the major landscape changing event? So I do think there's a challenge and an irony and also an opportunity for, whatever level we are in our careers. If we're moving into like a leadership role or a people management role, that we have to differentiate between management and leading. Management is literally more like a governance type role. Whereas as a leader, and I think that's harder, as a leader, we have to create an environment, and especially if we're looking for innovation, we have to create an environment that allows for that perceived failure. And it is a perceived failure. I'm not sure if it was Thomas Edison or, somebody of that nature that basically said, when they failed to create a light bulb that worked the first 1,000 times, not one of those was a failure. It was a learning experience till they got it right. And I think it's rare that we, as a community, a global community, I think it's rare that we foster that kind of environment where, how do we measure failure where the perceived failure is actually a success because we're supposed to fail fast? If that makes sense. I think there's a challenge.
Right. Do you think that's a metrics thing?
I think it is. I think metrics, when, in my opinion, there are good metrics and the bad metrics. And how I differentiate between a good metric and a bad metric is, what behavior does it evoke?
Okay.
So we can think, well, a metric is a way to measure. Okay, great. But when we set a target for a metric, then we literally, as a leader, we have to think about, well, what behavior will that target for that metric now engender?
Right.
I'll give you an example specifically, like, in cybersecurity and compliance and risk management. So there are some third-party vendors that I've worked with over the years, and from a pricing perspective, some of their pricing models are volumetric. So let's say if they wanted, I don't know, some risk assessment or whatever, and maybe they've got a software that does it, and he says, okay, so for every assessment, we're going to charge you X cents or X number of dollars or pounds or centimos or whatever. Well, there's a metric associated with that, because clearly you're going to budget around that. But what that model then does is it has the potential to create bad behavior. So let's say, for example, if I need to do 1,000 risk assessments, but I've only budgeted for 999, then I'm not going to do that next risk assessment. So that metric, if you like, that measurement is now creating a behavioral outcome on my part. But it's probably bad for an unintended behavioral outcome. And therefore the impact on the business could be quite substantial if I'm incented, because of metrics, I'm incented to make the decision to, okay, I'm not going to do that assessment. So that's probably not the best example, but you see where I'm going with that is that how we measure and how we create targets. What we're actually doing is we're creating a behavioral outcome. We're creating a behavioral pattern. So back to this whole idea, if we're running a shop that's absolutely solely dependent, almost solely dependent on innovation. And we have this mantra of fail fast, fail forward, you know. But if the metrics that we're using to measure people's performance, if they are off kilter with that, then our metrics will create bad behavior. So that's how I differentiate between a good metric and a bad metric. It's not whether it's mathematically correct. It's like what behavior does it evoke? If it's bad behavior or poor behavior or not the behaviors we're looking for, then it's a bad metric.
You're pointing at one thing that I've noticed myself over the last few years that's been a common trend in the leadership atmosphere is goal-oriented management styles or leadership styles as opposed to task-oriented leadership styles. Um, and I think that the difference between the two is clear. Like one is, hey, here's the goal. Let's get there by any means possible within, moral and ethical boundaries. And then the other one is, hey, complete XYZ, and when you were complete with XYZ, come back to me for ABC. And that poses its own challenges. And much to your point, the metrics that we use to measure all of that stuff can either incentivize bad behavior or lead people to make good decisions. And we've seen this play out on a large scale with that big, I can't remember the name of the bank, but there's a big bank scandal, and they incentivized their bank managers to achieve a certain metric. And I think it was just like number of bank accounts opened in a certain period of time. And what they ended up doing was like opening up all these fake accounts from all these people that didn't exist. And just because they were getting a little bonus at the end of the month on top of their checks. And before you knew it, there was this fraudulent like a ridiculous number of fraudulent accounts because of this bad behavior. And everybody knew it was going on, but they didn't know how to fix it. And the whole thing imploded on itself. And so that's, I think, just on a grand scale, what could happen if we get it wrong. So you've played in this sphere with a lot of real big players, Meta, Verizon, HP, like these are some of the top players in the game. I wonder how, in your experience with them and then into your own business, how you have kind of carved out what the customer experience looks like, and then how you empower your team to make that customer experience a remarkable one on all fronts.
That's a great question. We should do a follow-up podcast just on that one, one question.
It's a big
But
question,
I
Gavin.
think it is a bit. It is a big question. So I'll kind of break it into a couple of different kind of thought streams, if that's okay. So I think the metrics where it's very much task oriented. I think there are definitely specific functions and roles where that is completely appropriate, and it's really the only way for certain functions to measure that kind of well. When you talk about goal, the goal centric one, I personally I just call it outcome based, right? So if I have somebody that's, and particularly like somebody who's managing a function, leading a product or whatever, and if we say, well, look, here's the outcome that we're looking for. We're expecting that we're going to increase our market share by X, or we're expecting that we're going to increase our profitability by Y. I'm a big fan of the SMART goals, so it's got to be realistic, it's got to be measurable, it's got to be time bound, so I think that whole framework kind of does make sense with that. But then we literally, and we assume that ethics and all that is all baked in. But then as a leadership team, we have to really then analyze ourselves and scrutinize ourselves and say, is that truly how we're going to measure? And what I mean by that, like let's say if I set you a goal and said, hey, Devin, can you take over this this new product stream that we want to put together? We think we've got a market for it, and what we're looking for is to garner, X dollars in revenue. Well, it'll be up tail, down tail, and most likely expectation. Well, that's goal centric. Then I actually should not care whether it takes you 1 hour to do that, or if it takes you 1 month to do that, if it's within that time bound period. Does that make sense?
Yep.
So if you can spend 1 hour doing that, and you spend the rest of the month, hanging out with your son and going off for another trip to Disney and all that, it's like, hey, but did you deliver what I asked of you? And the answer is yes. Then if I then say, yeah, well, what did you do with the rest of your time? Well, in theory, that should not be my business. It's like I'm paying you for an outcome, you know. So I think sometimes we, as leadership teams, we can kind of get lost in almost like time clocking people and simultaneously expecting them to deliver on goals. It's like, well, which is it? You know, sometimes you, if you can do it in an hour, good, well done you. You know, and by the way, if you're using AI, as long as it's a private LLM, we might talk about that for a little bit. You know, so there's no privacy related issues around the data model that you're using. Then well done you. You know, and then but then equally, if I was to say, but the reward will be here's the, I said earlier, you know, the uptail, the downtail, and most likely. If you're already knowing that you're delivering on most likely and it's costing you 1.5 hours a month because you just really found a wicked way to do it, you know, you may say, I'm gonna blast through the uptail as well. And then my reward scheme should include the fact that, well, what if you do the blast through that? You should be rewarded for being, you know, effective and efficient. So as I look at it, so that's one kind of four stream. The other is this, and I won't say which company, but I'll tell you a mantra that I have had for a long time. Probably one of the largest organizations that I built and led was it was nearly 2,000 people, and we were serving customers in 60 different countries, and we went through. At the end of each year, you know, you go through the performance management program where you measure the performance of your staff. And there was this idea that says, well, we don't do forced ranking, but we expect the curve to look like this. And what the curve is, X% should be probably underperforming, and maybe you're going to put them on a performance improvement plan. You know, Y% should be, you know, absolutely knocking the ball out of the park every single time. And then there's a bit of a blend in between. So we don't do forced ranking, but you kind of do.
Right.
So what I highlighted is that whole model of performance management actually creates bad behavior from leaders. Mm-hmm. And here's why. Because I said, I pride myself in, I will manage underperformance throughout the year. I will manage underperformance and I'll manage it up or I'll manage it out.
Right.
Right. So if you're telling me that you expect me to hit the end of the year with 5% of my people truly underperforming, you're telling me I'm terrible at my job.
Or that it's okay to be bad at your job.
Or mediocrity is exactly what you're looking for. Well done. So that whole model actually drives for mediocrity. I said, and also what you're actually encouraging me to do is sandbag poor performance. So at the end of the year, I can say, oh yeah, I've got the 5%, you know, let's deal with that. I tried managing them up, now they're managed out. So those kind of, you know, not force ranking, but really is force ranking. I completely and vehemently disagree with those models. Any people manager, any leader should be measured by their ability to manage top performers and for them to manage underperformers either up or out. And if that manager shows up, to me, if that manager shows up at the end of the year with 5% of underperformers, I don't know, like, you've been terrible at your job this year. Why, you know, how much money have we now lost and wasted because you tolerated mediocrity for 11 months? So again, it's those metrics that essentially create behavioral abnormality. So, yeah. Anyway, that's and I would like to say it's not that. By the way, that experience is not limited to one company in my career. I think it's a theme that I see across most of the capitalistic societies on the planet. You know?
Right. There's this funny thing that as much as I want to deny it, as soon as somebody pointed it out to me, I can't stop seeing it. And it's this idea of the 80-20 rule. And 80% of the results is going to come from 20% of the team, or 80% of the result that you get comes from the 20% of the work that one individual actually did. And or when it comes to like marketing and growing the business, it's like 80% of your customers come from the 20% of your budget that you're actually spending properly, and the other, you know, percentage of the budget's not really doing anything. And so there's a real challenge there to like how does one even begin to think about optimizing the customer acquisition process when there is that big of a gap between the experimental stuff that you do because you want to innovate and you want to come up with new things, especially in how fast the life cycle of marketing is. Like one idea works really, really well until it doesn't work ever again. We saw this
Yeah.
with the influencer model. A ton of influencers came out, and because they were doing, silly things and they had an audience of people watching them, they were able to plug things like energy drinks or, slime for children. But at the end of the day, it's that whole idea, that whole model of becoming an influencer got so saturated that it fizzled out. And now we as consumers, as soon as we see an influencer shilling or hacking some product, we immediately scroll by them. So how do
Yeah.
you navigate the vicious waters of this marketing atmosphere without capsizing the boat?
Uh, yeah, I get another deep question. That was-
I'm sorry, Gavin. I thought I was going to go easy on you, but
no, well, they're not easy questions. Else, otherwise, that you wouldn't ask them because the whole world would have solved it already. Um, I think I'm going to take it back to me moving countries, and every move was literally a cultural change. When I showed up in Spain, I didn't even know hola. I mean, I didn't speak Spanish at all, and yet I was living in a town where we were the only English speaking people. So I had to buy a house and get a mortgage, and buy a car and get a loan from a car, and all in Spanish because my bank manager didn't speak English. Um, and the reason why I'm using that as an example is so the methods and techniques that I used in England to buy a house and get a mortgage and get a car and whatever did not work in Spain. Not even the language was the same. So to your question, I think we collectively need the ability to recognize when change is either happened already, has happened already, or whether when change is in progress or when change is on the horizon. And we have literally had to say what used to work yesterday will not work today. So, you think about like generative AI. There is so much fear around Gen AI. I don't know if you've seen some similar things, Dan, but people like
Mhm.
there's the fear of like, no, we need to create a regulatory environment to control it before we really adopt it. Now, if we do that, here's what's going to happen. If we did that as an entire society, we will completely be left behind because there'll be other parts of the society that will say, no, we're just going to embrace it wholeheartedly. We'll figure out how to regulate it later, if ever.
Right.
And with most technological breakthroughs, that is kind of what happens. If you think about, for the most part, not every regulation, but for the most part, regulation is there to protect, for example, consumers. When as an individual consumer you don't have a loud enough voice. Whereas if you're a giant corporation like a B2B environment, you've probably got a massive legal team. So you've got for B2B you've got this massive legal engine that protects the interests of the business and protects the interests of the shareholders and what the board's looking for. But as a consumer, we're one voice out of 8 billion on the planet. And so regulation is really there to be the voice of the individual consumer for the most part, which is also why, therefore, it's relatively slow, comparatively speaking, to actually catch up. In other words, things typically have to have gone wildly wrong for then regulation to step up and say, we need to create some rules around that. And so if we think about that, to your question from a marketing perspective, what worked even yesterday might not work today. So I was watching an interview. I can't remember the gentleman's name. It was about 7 or 8 months ago, and he was talking to. He's a very well respected lawyer, and he was talking to a whole group of lawyers. And he said, I've been asked the question: Will AI make paralegals? Will it put them out of jobs? Will AI even take lawyers and put them out of work? And his answer was no. He said, what you'll have is lawyers that use AI will succeed, and those that don't will go do something different. But I think that was a very pertinent point. Is that regardless of how much we would like regulation to kind of over, to kind of come in and kind of govern, I think the reality is it's moving with such expediency and the rate of change. I think we have to be self-governing. So I alluded to it a little bit earlier about, for example, if you, I'm very reticent about what I will put into any online AI, whether it's ChatGPT, whether it's, Copilot, or, the other companies, some of my former employers, for example. um, actually, the co-founder of Mercury, my business partner, she put it this way. She said, treat AI like you treat any social media. If you're going to put it into a public engine or a public LLM, you might as well just be posting it on Instagram or TikTok or Facebook or whatever. So if you treat it that way, then when you've got company IP, would you drop it on Facebook? Well, if you wouldn't, then don't drop it into an AI that's using a public LLM, large language model.
Right.
If it's a private language model or a private data set, then have at it, And I think as a general rule of thumb, that's probably the smartest, easy rule of thumb, so that we can actually embrace the technology, embrace this kind of massive wave of change, which is transformative. This isn't the year of AI. This is the decade of AI they were embarking on. And if we're going to wait for regulation to kick in to govern it, then we will absolutely be left behind, and regulation will. And I'm not being critical of regulators. It just is the way it is. Their job is to clean up and put stuff in place for things that already went wrong. I mean, Sarbanes-Oxley was an example of that. It already went wrong. Let's put some regulation around this. So yeah, it's. I know we went up completely tangential there from the original question, but you're asking about, marketing and like, what worked yesterday won't work today. Yeah, we're in a constant state of change, and sometimes the rate of change is so fast, then sometimes we can't even anticipate the change. What the constant is the change.
Right.
And so if we work on that, then that gives us, again, resiliency. That gives us stability. It's like the one constant factor is rapid change. All right. So how do we now build our marketing plan? How do we build our success story, if you like? And by the way, I also agree with what you said earlier, Deb. This whole idea of 80-20 is, to me, that's like so wasteful. I mean, can you imagine if we did that with our own personal finances?
Right.
Well,
unfortunately,
hey,
I think that's what some people are currently doing, Gavin.
I mean, like if I was to say to my wife, "Hey, just want to let you know, I squandered 80% of my income last month," she'd be like, "What?" You know what I mean? So
Be on the curb.
for our personal finances, normally that's unacceptable. So I think there's also a little bit of a tightening of those metrics that we need to be looking at too.
Right. And it's really good getting this from somebody whose job, it quite literally is risk management and security and being safe and making these decisions and managing our teams and all that kind of stuff. And, the one thing that I didn't want to brush past was the idea of like regulatory bodies or somebody kind of coming in to control it and how that limits things. And I'm always wary, if not straight up fearful, of concentrated pockets of power when it comes to whether it's a large corporation that we're supposed to be able to vote with our dollars, but we can't when there's only one option disguised as 10. Right? When it's one company that disguised itself as 10 companies and we think that we're voting with our dollars, but we're actually not. Well, there's a problem there, right? And so this is a part of like what I foresee us evolving through. We are currently in another one of those ages of revolutions, just like we were when the industrial age came about and it changed the way that we did things. Same with the agricultural revolution. There was a lot of things that changed and a lot of people didn't like doing it that way, but look at where we are now and what we have available to us and how we can continue to innovate. So I think the argument can be made for both sides. But in you know in pursuit of finding right rather than being right, I think it's important that we at least take some time to explore what the potential could be before we wholeheartedly commit to something. And so, when it comes to the decision making and the things that you do to innovate and grow the business, what do you do to mitigate the risk? Because I get that there's never going to be zero, but I do know that there are things that you might do to safely navigate that. What does that look like?
Yeah, actually, what the answer I'm about to give you, Devin, it really ties into even as Mercury, kind of when it comes to risk management, what we do that is foundationally different from a lot of other approaches. And this goes back even pre-Mercury. This goes back throughout. So this is learning throughout, my career basically. But you mentioned about mitigating risk, for example. You said, yeah, you can't have zero risk, but we have to mitigate risk. And what's really interesting is in most other domains of business and risk management, what we look for is a return on risk. What we don't typically look for is a reduction of risk. Until we get to something like cybersecurity, then all of a sudden in cybersecurity, oh no, reduce risk at all costs. But in reality, then that's not commensurate to the way we do risk management in any other business domain. So when you think about credit risk, for example, what if you and I we're running a business and we decide that we're selling to consumers, and we decide that for somebody to get an account with us, we want them to have at least a score of 650 on the credit score. And if they come back between 600 and 650, we'll still give them an account, but we're going to take a deposit from them just in case. And anyone below 600, we're going to say, no, we're not going to do business with you. Well, that's an example of credit risk, right? So what if then we said, what if we adjusted those targets and we say, 625 and 590? Well, two things would happen. One, we'd attract more customers because we wouldn't be turning people away. And we'd have an increase in the number of people that don't pay their bills. But after a month or two, we're just going to cut the services anyway. So there's an example of a return on risk, right? So what we really would be doing is saying, okay, so if we drop the bar, we're gonna have a higher acquisition rate of these consumers, which means we're going to get an uptick in our revenue. Yes, we're going to have a downtick in some on collectibles, but we're going to plateau those by saying 2 months. No more sort of thing. So the return on that risk, as in the on collectibles, we might look at that mathematically and say it's worth it. So we're not looking to actually reduce the risk. We're looking for the return on that risk. And so I think, whether we apply it in our personal lives, every time I moved to a different country, I was taking a risk. But what I was looking for is the return on that risk. I wasn't looking to reduce that risk. I'd have to never emigrate. If I was looking to reduce the risk, I would never have left England. But the return on the risk is okay. So what kind of ridiculously amazing experiences am I going to have, or my kids going to have, or my wife's going to have, or what new friends am I going to make that I didn't even know existed before? That's the return on the risk. And of course, I'm going to a new job, then, hopefully the salary is higher than the job before, so there'll be a financial return as well. So I think, from a business perspective, I think if we exclusively think about mitigating risk or avoiding loss, then we're not actually doing risk management. We're just trying to avoid loss. Whereas risk management is really getting to the point where you can say, based on all the things that are at least knowable, what return will we get if we take this risk here? But equally, what risk do we not want to take because the return just doesn't make sense? So that's like I said, we've adopted that even as a philosophy, not just a philosophy, as like a foundation, and to our approach to risk management. And it's not new. We've been doing it as humans for thousands and thousands of years. It's just sometimes in business, and particularly in cybersecurity risk, we get lost in the fear, uncertainty, and doubt. Even after all these years, there's still a lot of FUD.
Right. So what sorts of challenges exist then when it comes to your approach to customer acquisition? When the return on risk is kind of like and for the record, this for me, that is very new. This is a new idea, a new way of looking at it. So I'm just trying to wrap my head around it. Because if you're going to spend the dollars to get your business out there to the world, there is an unlimited number of ways that you can do that. And at some point, you have to look at all of the different paths that you've taken and decide on which one is yielding the best return. And so, how do you guys navigate that, or how do you specifically look at that from your perspective?
Yeah, so I think part of the challenge, Devin, very very candidly, is exactly what you just called it out. Is it is a newer way to think about risk management, particularly in technology risk. It's not new to most other risk domains, but it is new, particularly through the eyes of technology risk. And by technology risk, we include cyber risk, we include potential physical world harm for users and things like that. So that's all kind of essentially technology risk domain for us. But it is therefore in technology risk and cyber risk. It's a newer way to think about risk management, and that's part of the challenge because. In fact, I got into a little bit of a friendly debate recently, and somebody was talking about some of the other risk management models, and they were saying, well, but it's standards based, as in the other models are standards based. And I said, yeah, it is, and it's been failing for the last 15 years. So just because something is standards based and therefore you can understand it, doesn't mean it's the right approach. And, a physical world example of that would be, when general anesthesia was first introduced, the medical profession thought it was the most amazing thing ever. And of course it was. But one of the biggest failures was the standard at the time is it was the surgeon that would also administer the anesthesia. And it was only after a significant number of deaths that were not caused by the condition, but they were caused by the accidental either underdosing or overdosing of anesthesia. The whole discipline of anesthesiology was created. It's like, no, we need somebody that's like specializes in just this, how to keep a patient just asleep enough without killing them, So the surgeon can actually do what she or he does best, which is do the actual surgery, But the point being, prior to that, the standard was that the surgeon was also administering the anesthesia. So for us, that's been one of the challenges, and continues to be one of the challenges. Is how do we kind of overcome this idea that, well, we have these standards that are 15, 20 years old, and so what we've done to address that is again and again, back to the physical world example of, learning a new language. For me, the way I learned Spanish was two ways. One was I went on an immersive course where even the teacher didn't speak English. And that was, you talked about like getting a bit teary eyed earlier.
Yeah.
I can tell you on day 9 of that, I was literally crying thinking, I'm not going to be able to do this. And I remember the very first time that I woke up one morning and I realized I just dreamt in Spanish, which was the most amazing thing, to actually be dreaming in Spanish.
No kidding.
But what I had to do was I had to, in my mind, I had to build correlations between English, which I didn't know, and Spanish, which I didn't know. But I'll give you a very simple example. Most English words that end in Tion, if you replace the T with a C and shorten all the vowels, that's the Spanish word. So indication, indicación, revelation, revelación. So not all of them, but most of them. And by the way, once you've done that, you now know 700 Spanish words that you didn't know before. But the point being is I took what I did know and figured out how to map it to what I didn't yet know, so I could learn Spanish. So the approach that we're taking, Devin, is to say, okay, well, how do we articulate risk management when we're looking for a return on risk, and how do we articulate that in ways that's using vocabulary and models that our or either clients or potential clients understand? Because once we do that, then they'll see the value of this approach, and then it becomes very, very stark very quickly. So again, tying that back to one of your early questions, I think from a marketing perspective, the art, and it is an art. It's probably more as much art as it is science, like music. Um, it's the art of knowing what our potential target customers, first of all, who they should be, um, really understanding the world through their eyes. You said just earlier, is seeing the world through your son's eyes, and just how impactful that was. For us to understand the world from our customers' eyes, and then literally saying to ourselves, then how will we reach them, and what does the messaging need to be that will make them curious enough to say, yeah, we should take a look at this. And how that looked last year, I'll tell you this right now. Mercury's been we're coming up on 2 years of age, and we've been doing this. Me and my co-founder, we've been doing this kind of work for well over a decade. What worked 10 years ago doesn't necessarily work as well today. What worked 10 months ago doesn't necessarily work as well today. So it's just that constant, change is the new normal, change is the new static, if that makes sense.
Yeah, well, if there's anybody who has demonstrated an ability to be comfortable in uncomfortable situations, it's you, Gavin. I think it's a testament to your creativity and ability to adapt, right? And I think that that's a huge part of what has made you so successful, and what I think is going to continue to bring you success in all of the endeavors that you venture out on. Gavin, this has been wonderful. I can't tell you, you've been so generous with your time and your wisdom, and I'm very grateful for everything that you've shared with me here. Because we're reaching kind of the end of our time together here, so I just want to make sure I check all the boxes. Two more things on our way out here. If you could maybe, and I know this is again a very difficult question, but if you could concisely provide one single piece of advice for somebody who's in a similar role as you, who's navigating these challenges and trying to overcome them, what would that piece of advice be?
It'd be really kind of two sentences. One is don't be afraid to look like you failed.
Hmm.
And related to that is communicate really, really well in setting expectations. And the reason why I say that is as I look back, I've had some really high points in my career, and I've had some really, really stressful points in my career as well. And when I look back at both of those, the one thing that they have in common is how well I communicated, or how poorly I communicated expectations, as in not what I expected of other people, or really what they should expect of me.
Hmm.
And that's, for me, when I've been very effective at communicating what you should expect from me, typically things, I could fail 1,000 times, but I've set the expectation. And the expectation I've set is that failure is not failure, failure is learning. And we will be successful. But we still time bound it. Equally, some of the most painful moments I've had in my career is when I was not so effective at that kind of communication. And so expectations from the other person or the other organization were here, and my expectations of them were here, and we missed each other. So it's like digging a tunnel from both ends. You've got to be really, really clear on what you expect of each of the tunnelers, so you hit in the middle. So it's that is what facilitates and creates an environment where failure is not failure. Failure is learning on the journey to successful outcomes. And then I guess I said two, but one other thing is we talked about earlier about metrics. Just be aware that whatever metrics and targets you set, they are going to create behavioral norms. And so if you really start with the desired behavior or the desired outcome, and then say, well, what are the metrics that will drive that behavior, as opposed to the other way around, focusing on the metrics and not even thinking about the potential behavioral outcomes that you didn't desire. So.
Very, very powerful advice, Gavin. If somebody wanted to reach out to you to pick your brain further or perhaps work with you, what's the best way to do that?
Well, on LinkedIn, it's Gavin Grounds. So you'll find me there. I do keep my profile open for connections. You're not going to be asked for an email address or anything like that. So, you can find me on LinkedIn. Um, and yeah, that's probably the easiest way. I mean, I'm on Instagram and all the other platforms as well. But if you find me on LinkedIn, then just send me a direct message and we can exchange phone numbers or whatever. So yeah, very open to that.
Wonderful. We'll make sure to link to that in the show notes. And if you're watching and listening to this and want to get in touch with me and my team for your marketing needs, by all means, visit nextgengrowth.com. Otherwise, that's it for this episode. Thanks for joining us for this conversation, and I will see you in the next.